Welcome to the podcast series Talking Success, connecting the global FinTech community. I'm Stacey Jafta, and today I'll be chatting with Ivan Maryasin, CEO and co-founder of Monite. Monite lets B2B brands embed invoicing, API automation, expense management into their existing interface in 3 to 5 weeks. Hi, Ivan. How are you?
Hi, Stacey. Great. Thanks for having me.
Of course, so happy to have you on. Just before we pressed record, we were talking about the pronunciation of your business. I asked if it's Monite, and you said that's what the people say. But I said, listen, I want to know the real pronunciation. Can you tell me a little bit about the background and the change of pronunciation as time went by?
Yeah, absolutely. I think naming a startup is always one of those things where, you're kind of like, you don't really know what to do and you struggle hard and you pick some name, but tendency is like MVP names tend to get sticky. So it's hard to change later on. So we invested more time this time into thinking about the name, picking something scalable, something that is not kind of taken from a trademark perspective where the domain is available. And Monite was basically the original pronunciation. So connected to money, scalable, FinTech topic, flexible enough for all sorts of like business changes. Now, when we brought it to market and we started speaking to people, it quickly became Monite. And we were like, okay, so then it's Monite. And over time, we actually ourselves are switching to Monite. I think that's actually the correct way of pronouncing it. But it is what the market tells you it is.
Okay, Monite, it sounds French.
Well, I think it's international, so it doesn't kind of ring any red flags in any of the locations where we might operate. But yeah, something connected to money, definitely.
Got you. Awesome. Well, before we go any further, I'd just love to understand and hear more about your career before building the business, and then essentially what gave you that idea, and then the purpose behind Monite.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm actually a marketer by background. I had my first business at the age of 16. I was kind of bored in school and I was like, okay, I got to do something practical. So I first did a marketing consultancy for small companies back home in Russia, and then got really into the topic, loved the beats with digital marketing and everything, and eventually ended up in Silicon Valley growing different B2B SaaS companies, anywhere from pre-seeds to Series D company Bright Edge, YC company now Unicorn, People AI. And my experience has mainly been literally growing MRR, ARR for those folks. Until when Trump got elected, and at that moment I actually moved to Germany, and in Germany joined Penta early on as the head of growth. So it was pretty much bringing Penta to markets. And Penta is one of the key SME neobanks on the European markets, recently acquired by Konto. And so the journey with Penta actually brought me back to SME, where I actually started, where my parents' business is and where a lot of friends operate. And it was a great introduction to kind of FinTech in Europe and globally. And what Penta showed me was really that a lot of people are focused on the buzz and the noise. There's a lot of movement in the card space, people building better account, better cards, and it all makes sense. However, talking to the businesses, and as a marketer, I try to do this as often as possible, I felt like there is a bigger fish to fry. And the bigger fish to fry was very simple, that if you're a small business owner, you definitely don't want to struggle with your bank, or you don't want to have a low limit on your cards. But your biggest pain is actually running admin for the business. Because when you open up a business, you don't want to do that. You really want to focus on what you do best. And while there is a lot of noise around how people save you hours and hours of time, you still have 90% of the market sitting with manual processes, Excel, etc. And this was the moment where I saw the space to really innovate and change. And this was when I started Monite.
Awesome. Just backtracking a little bit, I heard you mention working with businesses on ARR. So can you go into depth about that? So what does that mean? A business brings you on and they ask you to help them with reoccurring revenue, helping them with strategies, or looking at their product and making it more of a subscription? Or what does that look like?
Look, I think it's always a combination of things, but my role was always I always split growth and marketing terms, because to me marketing is a more traditional way of putting it. Growth is more holistic. So to your point, the aspects around strategy, product, etc. So I would say I always did growth to the extent I could. In some companies, it meant like the way I usually worked with the business is like I would be brought in as a internal marketer, internal growth person. And then I would basically look at their funnel and try to understand where can most impact be made. And for some companies, it's like, look, the sales work just fine. There is good conversion rate, all works. Now we need
Mm,
more leads. So then we
got
would work
you.
on top funnel. In other cases, you would see that there are a lot of leads coming in, but certain leads aren't converting and they're not
Yeah.
converting for the right reasons. And so then you basically go and work more on topics like product marketing and sales enablement. And I've been fortunate enough to actually work all across the funnel, basically mostly focusing, of course, on lead generation and top funnel, but also having quite a lot of experience on how to work with pricing, specific propositions for specific customers, like product marketing or sales enablement or other topics. And in this area, I think one thing that I learned over years is, I think I mentioned this to you earlier as well, is like just thinking in Amazon press releases about product strategy and about many
Mm.
different things you do in the business. Because as founders, as product people, we often get excited about what we built, but it doesn't mean that the user is going to be as excited.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I try to stay conscious of like there is a real market, even if the market is wrong objectively, the market is always right, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. I was having a conversation with a client on Friday, just talking about like when to pivot. I had two people in the conversation. One was talking about how their business just like never pivots. Like they will be headstrong with this is the idea, like this is the product, we're going with it no matter what the market says. And then the other person in the conversation was just talking about how they find that their company pivots too quickly before fully understanding or giving the market a chance to adapt to this new product. Finding product market fit can be tough and often requires pivoting. How do you retain your people and gain buy-in from the team during a big change like this?
Absolutely. Look, so let me break it down into two parts. One is the pivoting itself, and the second one is kind of navigating through the pivot. So to me, the pivots really should come from the core mission of the company. We, for example, made a pivot too, but we stayed absolutely intact in terms of our mission. And so I think where I would say innovation happens is exactly where people pivot. I know very few, for example, companies in infrastructure space, they didn't pivot early on in their journey. Actually, a lot of infrastructure providers started as B2B providers until they realized there is a lot bigger game to play infrastructure wise. And so I think to me, it's just a function of like being conscious enough about what your mission actually is and why you're
Yeah.
building what you're building in the end. And second is being brave enough to pivot. So I had this talk with one of the VC partners we have, and she made a point. She was like, "You guys pivoted at this stage where you had hundreds of customers, and some of
Yeah.
them were actually paying, and you had to kill them all, and you did it.
Mm.
Although some of your competition was actually even behind you, and you yet pivoted." And I think it's just like for us, it was always the question of like, what are we trying to do? In
Mm.
Monite especially, it's focused on really changing this admin, but not like on a website framing, like, oh, we did it for one market for whatever 1,000 people, but really on a global level. And when we saw an opportunity to do this differently, so go to market not directly, but via infrastructure that enables platforms to do this for the customers, we were like, look, so we could actually go from like, 10,000 customers ourselves in 3 years to like a million customers with service. It's a completely different strategy. It's not something we thought about early on, but it totally makes sense to the mission. And so I think,
Yeah.
and this is where I want to connect to your second part. And maybe let me pause here and see if you have any questions on the first one.
No, that makes perfect sense. I think I was going to ask, how did you feel it was the right time to pivot if you had hundreds of subscribers or customers using it, but you could see the bigger picture where that could turn into millions versus a couple hundred?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just really understanding that you will lose some of the parts you love. Like we had to lose our interface, right? Because now we're an API. We had
Yeah.
to lose direct touch with the users, although we love the users. Now, where I think this decision has to come is it has to come as early as possible, because the later it
Mm.
comes, the more expensive it is. And for some time, I was even thinking like, can we maybe do both? And then I got a lot of wake up calls from the founders in the space I've spoken with who did a similar thing. So I think the question here is like just kind of being conscious of why you're doing this, and
Okay.
staying core to the mission. And second one is being brave enough to do it early on. not waiting until, you have all the indications. So to your point, like, you need to have some clear market feedback on what's working and what's not working. You don't want to pivot like every 2 months, but
Yeah.
at the same time, when you get this gut feeling, and I have to say it's a lot about gut feeling, then you probably have to do it. The one thing I want to point out here is that most founders who are building something have good vertical experience in their space. So my recommendation to many founders out there is just trust your gut feeling. It's rarely wrong, but it is often wrong if you start layering on top 200 opinions from other people. You know
Exactly.
best what's best for your company.
Okay, so you mute everyone out. Now you've made the decision. How do you get the buy-in?
Yeah, so actually, where the dots connect is actually going from the mission. So it starts with a hiring strategy where you need to get the right folks on the board. But if people from day one really understand what you're trying to do and for whom and why this is important, it's less of the how. And this is what we saw as well, that we retained absolute majority of the team during the pivots. We obviously had to change some people due to the change in nature of business from sort of B2B typical SaaS game to infrastructure sort of enterprise sales game. And this is where the change needed to happen. But most of the folks, especially tech team and the most kind of sensitive parts of the company, actually stayed intact. And people saw that we'll literally, as founders, do whatever it takes to have the company succeed, which I think is another way to view a pivot. Pivot is not always negative. Sometimes
Yeah.
it shows people that if there is, for instance, no traction or something isn't working out, you're not just going to sit and pretend it's okay, like most companies do. You're going to take action, and you can take bold action. Which I think is equally important for investors, for employees, for advisors to see in order to actually keep supporting the company actively.
Okay. I'm throwing a spanner in the works because I know of a business that I've had on the podcast, and they were in the car dealership space. And they built this technology for people buying cars on credit. And they just realized that their technology was wanted and needed by other businesses. And they made a huge pivot from selling cars to being a technology company. That's like massive, right? That is a different mission. That is a completely different concept. How would you get the people on board then?
Look, I think the big part of any team is just having great chemistry, great trust to each other. And the mere reason why people even like work for companies or stay in companies is largely people focused, which
Yeah,
means that
exactly.
if you build a really inclusive and friendly workspace where people love being around, where they love their colleagues, where they generally think it's fun to work, as long as you can show them a compelling picture how their work is still needed, still going to be fun, the company still has great trajectory, they're more than incentivized to stay on board, and then kick in other kind of external incentives like VSOP, like benefits, like
Yeah,
salaries, like
yeah.
reviews. But I think the people chemistry is the most important thing. And what we also saw with some people was we had a couple people leaving, but the reasons why they left were fundamental misalignment between what they want to
Mm,
do and the nature of the business we're going into. Like, for instance, we won't need as much front end expertise as we would in B2B business. So obviously, people who want to work on interfaces and talk to directly to users
of
and
course.
this sort of game is just not possible. And those cases, you just need to let people leave and kind of split on good terms. The rest of the team is very likely to stay if the chemistry is good.
Okay, so now you got the people on board. What did you do to bring the solution to market?
Yeah, look, so what we basically did is, so in our case specifically, we had to basically change some of the tech aspects of how we're running the show and become API first. And I think this sort of go to market for us in early days, and even up until now, it's largely not manual, but sort of like sales focused. We have to go and speak with people. Luckily, we have quite a lot of demand coming inbound and from introductions, which means that even up until now, almost a year into the new game, we haven't really done any outbound. We're only going to start
Wow.
now. But this is just the result of really staying in the network. And I think it's highly specific to our industry where fintech is rather compact. People all know each other, and if you're doing something worthy, they would definitely refer you between one another. So that's been
Sure.
our experience in GTM. But in general, I would say like our pivots is actually largely an evolution of go-to-market. So when I talk to a typical VC, their perspective on what we do, they don't really see as much the product evolution. They look at us as like pivoting our go-to-market, because we used to think that we can bring this finance innovation, back office automation to SMEs directly. And then we figured out this is very limited way to actually do this because it's not super scalable. Now
Yeah.
we go
Yeah.
API first, it's a completely different game. So what really changed is our go-to-market.
Okay. Okay. I really want to hone in on the talent topic because talent is the core of my business, talent in the cloud. How do you ensure strategic success with the hiring strategy?
Um, Absolutely. Look, so I think it starts with understanding who you need on the team. And there, I would say the fundamental principle we've always followed is being conscious of knowledge gaps and kind of just like personality gaps and traits that we have
Mm,
as founders and building from there. So there are obviously hard skills that you're looking for, like, for example, development or marketing or whatever.
hmm
But you also need to be aware of, like, for instance, where you have more expertise, where less, and how you want to close the gap. So the way we built our hiring strategy, especially after the pivots, was largely based on gathering intel from other founders and experts in the space who probably knew 100 times better than us back then who we need. And so what I did back then is literally talking to dozens and dozens of founders who A, went through a similar pivot, and B, are building a similar business, asking them about hiring strategy, who they failed to hire in early stage and who is really needed, top mistakes they made, etc. From which we actually figured out who we need first. And then once we figured that out, we actually elaborated with all our contacts on like what are exactly the roles that we don't know well. Like head of API was one of the first roles we were looking for. I've never even known this role exists
yeah.
before I started hiring. And it took us some investigation to really understand what we're looking for to hire successfully.
Okay. Okay. So we've covered the importance of people meshing and kind of besides the mission and the vision of of the business is more so everyone just enjoying the environment that they work in. To do this successfully, you'll need to build the right culture. How did you do this?
Um, Yeah, so that's an amazing question. I think there is no easy answer. However, building the right culture comes down to first having your culture and not trying to mimic somebody else's. So I think there's a
Mm,
great book by Ben Horowitz, "What You Do Is Who You Are." That is actually super true. Whatever we as founders want to see as culture of our company, the culture is a live and living mechanism. So the chances are that it will be different from what we imagine, but bringing it closer to what we want it to be is making it authentic. So
mm,
what we try to do is my co-founder, and he's actually great in this. He's just a super authentic person himself. We tried to make it a no bullshit culture, and we
mm.
just wanted to admit who we are, what weaknesses we have. We're a super fast company, but sometimes this has these consequences, or like we're super passionate about what we do, but yeah, we maybe sometimes miss out on work-life balance. So we started with like really really clear things, and then we tried to map the gap between like, okay, so this is where we stand and these are the parts we like. There are some parts that we don't really like and we want to evolve them, and then we mapped out a route how we want to get there as founders and as a team. And we started implementing initiatives to really close the gap. Like we wanted to increase the level of English in the team, not only in terms of language skills, but also communication skills. So we just sponsored coaches for speeches, for presentations, and this really paid
Yeah.
off. We wanted to show to the team that it's really important to know the industry. So we invested money and time to make our own course about the industry and encouraged everyone to see it, and made multiple Q&A sessions. We thought feedback culture is super important, but for certain members of the team, it's very different, than for others. So we made multiple feedback workshops and multiple 360s and multiple ceremonies where people could see that they can give me feedback openly as a founder in front of everyone, and I absolutely don't mind, which made them feel more confident about doing this in their daily work. So this is how we try to think about building culture, just very starting with a conscious picture, mapping out the strong sides and the weak sides, building out from authentic ground, and then basically going on a certain roadmap to what we want to achieve.
I want to hear your thoughts on something. So there's this hiring manager I work with, and in his first rounds of interviews, it's a culture interview versus most, I would say that's the last step. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, look, there is no straightforward answer. I think, yeah, I don't even know if I have kind of a clear take on this one now. But what I can say is that one of the things that always gets stuck in my head related to culture, and related to all these topics, is that whatever we try, the picture that I get in reality looks different. And I have to say that I've been personally struggling with this one for a while. I actually thought that I'm not doing enough as a founder and I should do something differently. I came to realize over time that, actually, to your point about hiring, the best way to shape the culture is to really be triple conscious about who you hire. Because in the early days, when you are a 10 people team, every person you bring in changes your culture, whether you want it or not.
Yeah.
And what we are doing now is we're actually thinking about our hiring strategy as a part of our culture strategy, as well as, of course, covering the hard gaps. It's not exactly the answer you're probably looking for, but I just wanted to give this pointer as one of the things that I thought of in the moment.
No, I love that. Okay, so you mentioned needing to find a head or a VP of API. How did you know it was the right time to invest in a team to build something versus buying the tech like an API?
Yeah, great. So that's a great question. I mean, in our case, API is what we built per se, but in this specific topic, we could also potentially use some kind of advisory expertise or avoid the hire, theoretically. I think this is exactly where I say, like, for a role like growth or marketing, I would have a straight answer for my own business because I know the area very well. For a role like the head of API, I had no idea. So I had to ask people on, how they build things, what were the biggest pains they realized over time, what was the early mistakes. And specifically for this role, every second founder in infrastructure would say that the way they built API platform, which is pretty much their product, is not really flexible enough, not really scalable. And when asked why, they said, well, because our CTO made decisions alone on how these things should work. And then I was like, okay, so what would you do differently? They were like, do not let tech people make the decisions alone. Get somebody who is leading the API as a product. And this was like,
Interesting.
okay, it basically sounded like this. You don't make this hire now. The cost of this down the line is about 10, 20, 30, 50 million. And with
No.
a and yeah, or more, because you basically have to rebuild parts of your platform later on. It's super costly and you will also lose business. And so then I was like, okay, so I don't really have a choice of whether or not to hire the person. And when assessing to hire or to get a consultant or something else, I think my take is always how core this expertise is to our business, A, and B, do I actually, how much would I save if I kind of, like, let's say, get a consultant versus a full timer? And all things being equal, this one pointed to hire, but I can also tell you that there are other positions where we decided against the hire and we decided to go with consultants.
Okay. Okay. The last question I have for you, Ivan, and this is something we chatted about a couple weeks ago, was building a business for scalability versus building first and figuring out how to scale later. You had some really great insights on this. Can you share?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a healthy balance in there. So again, I would go from the ambition and the vision I have in the first place and try to understand sort of like what is the balance between the MVP that I want to get to market quickly and the cost of this MVP to my revenue, to my scalability a bit down the line. And so the way we figured this out was basically ensuring scalability in the most affordable way possible without delaying any releases. And to be frank, I think people see a contradiction in that. I actually don't by now. I think it's just, do you want to build something scrappy that you'll have to redo many times over? Or do you want to invest a little bit more in a solid foundation? And to be frank, if you set the right framework for the team, if you incentivize people well, the difference in time to release this is going to be absolutely minimal. But the difference in maintaining this, in the cost you'll incur, in how much more revenue you can make, are absolutely paramount. And so in there, I would always say, do think about scalability early on. Do not build a rocket ship before you need to, but do not build something too scrappy, especially if you're an infrastructure business. Now, this probably doesn't apply one-to-one to like a typical SaaS company out there, except for cases where they really think that they're going to be taking off. And if the product starts breaking very easily with, another 100 users onboarded, I don't think that makes much sense.
Could you give an example of something you built for scalability at the time wasn't necessary?
Yeah, that's a good one. Wasn't necessary. Hard to say for our case, to be frank. I think now we're actually discovering that a lot of things we built are actually necessary, even if we didn't think about it back then. So
at the time wasn't necessary, but for future scalability.
Oh, for sure. That there are a lot of things. Like for instance, now in our API, we basically do accounts payable, accounts receivable as an embedded solution. So one of the things we built in early on was cross-country compliance rules based on many different layers. Like for instance, expenses in Germany might be based on, for example, days that you stay on a trip. Expenses in the UK might work completely differently, et cetera, et cetera. So like we built the flexibility into the system to work with different types of transactions or logic behind these transactions before we even had these functionalities live, or before we were even are live in these markets. And the reason behind this is because it's so fundamental to the architecture that doing it later would mean that we have to change too many elements. And as we build layered microservices architecture, then it's just not viable to do it later down the line. And another example actually includes, like, for instance, now we're using a single open banking provider, which is a bit of a technical detail here. But essentially, what we already built is the ability to plug in 100 other providers next to them. And it's absolutely core that we built it this way and not the other way around, because the scrappiest way would be like, oh, let's just plug in this provider. We first built the connector as in the generic elements that can take any provider and feed any data into the system. And then only we did the connector. So the difference is 1 to maybe 3 weeks of time for specific cases, but it makes a lot of difference when you start scaling and seeing edge cases come up.
Got you. Ivan, thank you so much for being on the episode.
Stacey, thanks for having me.
Of course. Where's the best place for listeners to reach you if they have some questions?
LinkedIn is absolutely the best to reach me, so feel free to ping me there. I'm happy to chat.
Fabulous. Thanks again.
Cool. Thanks, Stacey.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Talking Success, Connecting the Global FinTech Community. Feel free to follow us on LinkedIn at Talent in the Cloud. And if you're interested in exec talent, expanding your team, or you yourself are looking for a new, exciting change in your career, check out our website, talentinthecloud.io.